constructs. I originally um, had a conversation with a friend about this topic, but the footage was really bad because it was at nighttime and we were in the car. So even with the car light on, it just didn't look good enough for viewing. At least I wouldn't watch it, so I wouldn't assume anyone else would watch it either. But I was trying to like basically bring everything I ranted about in the previous two videos on cultural constructs to a close because it's still like stuff that was missing. And I know that sometimes what I was talking about may have sounded erratic because it was so much information I was trying to put out within a confined time. So I'm just gonna basically just summarize what I spoke about in the first two videos and give a overall um, summary from that. So I was talking about cultural constructs, and I was saying that politically, a lot of people get it wrong, both on the left and the right, but for different motivations. I was saying people on the right get it wrong because they're eliminativist about it, which is to say they don't believe social contracts exist, more or less. At least for some, I'm speaking very generally in a crude way. So I don't want anyone to say that this is everyone's set belief based on their political ideology. I'm just speaking in generalities. But generally, people on the right seem to be eliminativist about cultural constructs and the effect that they don't believe they exist. They believe they either are a part of underlying uh, biological reality, or they don't, or they just nothing burgers. Then there's the people on the left. They do believe social constructs exist, but they're subjectivist about it, which is to say they believe that there's no underlying like physical reality to it. It's basically they're basically ideas, and they're right and they're wrong at the same time because they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, which I made that analogy last time in the previous video. What I mean by that is you can't say something is real and that is at the same time subjective because the only way it's real is that it's in some sense objective. And in the definition of cultural constructs and social constructs more generally, is it identifies them as being phenomena, whether you know, whether it being something related to people, places, things, institutions that do cause real changes in our behavior and in the external world. So in some sense, they have to be real. They they can't just be subjective. And I gave the examples of cultural constructs that are always politically disputed: gender, intelligence, and race. And I gave the case that yes, that they are in fact cultural constructs to the left's credit, but to the right's credit, they do have underlying biological reality. I was saying gender has biological reality for one that is used interchangeably by almost everyone for biological sex, which is definitely a binary and fixed trait in humans, whereas gender is something more, I don't know, harder to grasp. But again, even the folks uh, who thump their chest about gender tend to interchange the word with sex when it when it's convenient. Besides that, something that again touches on real life behavior in the external world has to be objective, and we see that in the fact that in the gender affirming care, there's sexual hormone replacements, there's surgery involved, and other sorts of biomedical treatments. You don't do biomedical treatments for things that don't exist. And I was talking about intelligence, how it's one of the most quantifiable human traits in psychological science, that we can even measure the age at which it becomes even more hereditary for people, that we can find differences in it within different racial and ethnic groups, and that there's even sexual related differences in intelligence, such as, guys are tend to be generally better, general again, at spatial abilities, where women tend to be better at verbal abilities. But roughly, IQ is equal between the two sexes. Then I spoke about race, which, um, it seems almost common sense that there's something biological about it, because we can easily identify it when we see it, even though the definitions of race have been horrible over the generations. We know it when we see it. It's just that people have defined it poorly. But even if you want to define cool classifications like Clydes and or Clades or whatever, we know that there's some sort of differences between human populations who have been separated geographically, which have led them to not only look differently, but to have different biological markers. We know that there are some illnesses that only attack certain ethnic groups. Like I mentioned, sickle cell with Black Africans, um, and so forth. So, not only that, but there are biological anthropologists who can identify the skeletal remains. If you can identify the the racial grouping of an individual from their skeletal remains, there's something biological about it. Now, I'll agree that race is poorly defined, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Even more so in bioweaponry, which is supposed to be banned in the US and in other countries that have signed treaties on that. But we know that what we agree to and what the government actually does is a different matter. I don't want to get above my pay grade here. But in the research and bioweaponry right now, there are research and development programs going on to develop race-based weapons. That is, weapons that will only attack people of a certain ethnic group, which was hinted at the prior James Bond film, No Time to Die. Um, the way it was, met out in that movie might be a bit fanciful, but it is a genuine thing. So if you can attack someone's racial ethnic background with weapons, if there are certain illnesses that are prevalent within certain ethnic groups, if physical anthropologists can identify the race of someone from their skeleton, something biological about it. So, moving on from that, I wanted to talk more generally about social constructs. Cultural construct is a subset of social constructs, or we can say social cultural constructs if I want to be pedantic. But constructs generally is just any hypothetical phenomena in science which is presumed to exist by that theory. They are predicted to exist by the theory within question. Okay. But social constructs, like I said, are particularly social phenomena, which are said to exist because they exert real life changes in the external world and in our behavior. And in saying that, I had to touch on some psychological stuff, which is that how we crudely talk about social constructs and other things in psychology that aren't necessarily biological, but maybe, is that we say they're psychologically real, which in more nerdier terms we call mental representations. Now, I've literally done a whole graduate course on this, on mental representations within the philosophy of psychology. And I'm not going to give you my definition we had to give for a midterm. I'm going to dumb it down and just say that mental representations such as social phenomena or other mental representations such as like our linguistic phenomena can be said to be this. Mental representations are basically symbols that carry information which are manipulated by our minds for the purposes of knowledge. That's the most, I think, generic definition of that I can give. But I'm also privy to the language of thought hypothesis by the late Jerry Fodor, philosopher in cognitive science, who thought that our thoughts themselves are sentences encoded in the brain. That's what he thought thoughts were. They're sentences encoded in our brain, and that these sentences are defined over computational like processes, which basically just gives us a whole definition a of how the mind works. Basically, that the mind is sort of like a fleshy computer, excuse me, that processes information using these mental representations, such as thoughts, feelings, beliefs. Um, and we use that to understand and manipulate things within the external world and in our uh, cognition. Anyway, I'm going too far ahead of myself because I'm trying to keep this as dumbed down as possible. But yeah, so social phenomena are are psychologically real, even the ones that don't have a underlying biological reality, such as gender, intelligence, and race. All of them are psychologically real because they're mentally represented in our mind brains. Okay, um, these mental representations can be said to be physically realized in our brains through neural networks. If some people have ever heard of neural nets and stuff like that, I don't want to get too far, but basically they map across the brain, and you know they that's how they would be actually physically encoded in the brain. Whereas before I was just talking about it on a more functional level, and we can talk about just about anything in science at three different levels of explanation according to people like David Marr. You know, you have your physical or implementational level, right? Then you have like your algorithmic or law like or mathematical level. Then you have your functional level. So those are the three different ways of explaining stuff in like scientific explanations. But yeah, social constructs are psychologically real, and so far as they would be mental representations. Now, I can't say all of them are biologically real, but what I will say is they do all have some sort of physical reality to them, insofar as they can be physically manipulated by our minds for the purposes of belief and thoughts and knowledge. So that's where I'm going to end that. Um, if that sounds confusing, you can ask me questions for anyone who actually watches this. But again, social cultural excuse me, social cultural constructs are real. Some of them are biologically real, and some are psychologically real. And being biologically real, that means that they can be altered, they can be bettered, they can be harmed through certain biological processes. Things that are psychologically real can be used for the purposes of thought and knowledge and will be physically realized within a brain through mental representations. Um, so people on the left are wrong because they think they can have something for free, which is social constructs, without there being any sort of lawfulness to it, which is one of their problems. Is they basically reject that human behavior is a part of nature, which is governed by scientific laws, like everything else. People on the right just want to outright deny social constructs. And I can't blame them because the way people on the left talk about it, like they're subjective, they want to have something that's real and subjective at the same time, which is insane. But both are wrong, and that's the more accurate way to look at it in a very crude sense. Because I'm pretty sure someone who knows way more about this than me can pick out where I'm saying this is wrong too. But I think that's good enough, right? So I'm going to end that here, guys. If you have any questions on any of the three videos, leave me a question. But I think I think that was pretty spot on.